Você vai falar?
Mas eu acho que é língua oficial, então...
É, total, e tem...
Só tem tradução, né?
O problema é o meu espanhol, que é um portunhol bem macarrônico.
Ai, meu Deus.
Manda
Gente, eu não
aquele
sou muito
lafueto,
açúcar.
sabe?
Olá, gente, 11:08.
Minha fonte, olha aqui. Você morou aqui muito, né? Você morou aqui muito, né? Conhece?
Meu Deus.
Muito bem.
Parece?
Né?
Sim, eu morei 2 vezes. Eu morei uma primeira vez 1 ano e meio. Depois eu morei umas 7 vezes.
Onde você perguntar?
Nossa, cara, isso é minha cara.
Eu tinha um café da manhã, mas eu desmarquei. Você conseguiu chegar até o 1 da manhã. Não, mas não saí. Eu chegando de lá, eu tive que pegar real de avião. Aí eu pego de avião, que é noite, mais rápido. Esse mais rápido de trem. Eu cheguei aqui nas outras, casou 40 minutos.
Hello, welcome everyone to our panel on multi-level and meaningful transparency in algorithmic systems, developing concrete criteria to guide institutional legal reforms. So this session aims to identify key elements of meaningful transparency while exploring it in different contexts of uses of AI systems, looking to all stages of the AI system lifecycle. So meaningful transparency can be unfolded in different layers. So for instance, as an ethical principle or regulatory requirement, and it touches upon some of the most crucial issues relating to technology expansion and our social political contexts. So I'm very grateful for the organization for inviting me to moderate this panel. And we will be hearing from Gabriela Ramos, Assistant Director General of Social and Human Sciences Sector at UNESCO. And we'll also hear from Daphne Feinholz, who is Chief of Bioethics and Ethics of Science section. We will hear from Laura Schertel Mendes. She's a professor at IDP in Brazil, senior visiting researcher at the Goethe-University at Frankfurt am Main, and rapporteur of the Brazilian Senate Commission on the AI framework. After that, we'll hear from Jason Pilemaya. I hope that's okay. Executive Director at Global Network Initiative on broad history, and he'll speak about on the broad history of transparency reporting. Alexandra Walden, who's Global Head of Human Rights at Google, and Yasmin Kurti, who's a researcher at CTS FGV in Rio de Janeiro, and coordinator of the IGF Coalition on Platform Responsibility. So without further ado, we will hear from Gabriela. Thank you so much for having us here and for being here to speak about meaningful transparency.
Thank you so much, Clara. And I wish I could stay the whole panel with you, but I need to leave. And first, I need to apologize for the very unbalanced gender panel. But that's life for once. No, and interesting because it's a very highly technical issue, and sometimes the stereotyping might say that it's not the place, but here we are. I want to make some comments that we prepared on the basis of the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence that the General Conference of UNESCO adopted in 2021. This recommendation is the most comprehensive instrument, global instrument that there is in the international scene, because it not only includes the values and principles that we all know that artificial intelligence should pursue, but it also gets into the policies and how to implement it with 193 countries signing to it. And therefore, the principles, of course, are what we are discussing today, no? The question of transparency, the question of explainability. But the fact is that these principles are just guidelines, and then they really need to deliver for a very complex task of developing the regulation, the tools, the policies to make them happen, which is what makes life more complicated. At a high level, the transparency is an essential precondition for ensuring the respect, protection, and promotion of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and ethical principles in the AI systems. And in particular, transparency and explainability, these two principles for us, of course, are closely linked to responsibility and accountability and trustworthiness. So they are ingredients for what then would become a system that people can trust, and a system where if something goes wrong, there is a way to hold the system or the people accountable. Providing appropriate information and explanation to subjects of AI system can also help facilitate their understanding and foster trust. And the recommendation provides several concrete measures that member states should implement in relation to transparency. In general terms, users should be informed when a product or service has provided to them with the system of AI systems. And I think this is really important because as we are in this very hectic world and we get into the internet and we get the information, and sometimes we don't even know what's behind and how decisions are taken and who is taking the decisions and with what information, with what data, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, it's very important that we as AI users has this possibility of receiving transparency and meaningful explanation of the organization deploying the algorithms. But more importantly, when a decision is made and that decision has an impact on our freedoms, on our rights, here is really important that there is a human staff that can provide with the information that we require. Because many times we say that for content moderation or for transparency or for you use algorithms that chase algorithms. But at the end, it has to be the human that is responsible for these things. And then transparency and explainability are closely related, as outcomes and sub-processes leading to outcomes should aim to be understandable and traceable. And of course, these are very high-level issues. At the end, it's not so simple, but it has to be done, and it has to be at least recognized that it has to be done. A degree of transparency about a particular AI system may not, by itself, provide adequate information to users. For example, the way that a particular AI tool works, and this is, of course, as far as we can get, because the later derivation of getting meaningful explanation of AI systems and how decisions are made gets more complicated because sometimes the developers don't even know when there is a machine learning or black box or but we need to be able at least to have a value judgment on how we deploy the outcomes of these developments. The recommendation specified that the level of transparency and explainability should be appropriate and to the context and impact, and there might be a need to balance between transparency and explainability with other principles, because there are always trade-offs with privacy, trade-offs with safety, trade-offs with security. An example is when transparency can be releasing information that then could increase the risk of cyber attacks. This is something that we should be aware about. But the recommendation also says that whenever there are threats to human rights or human dignity, the obligation of transparency should be higher and may extend to requiring the sharing of the code and the data sets. I think that this question of IPR protection and copyrights and all these debates need to be put in the context that whenever there is a wrongdoing in the cyberspace, there should be a way to trace it and to reach liability regimes, because if we want to ensure that there is rule of law with the basis of transparency and explainability and accountability, there should be liability rules. And there should be the possibility to allocate responsibility, which is not something that is easy to do in this area. These are, of course, complex judgments, and it is up to the individual member states regarding the recommendation where to draw the line in balancing all these principles. But at the end, when we look at the whole impact that the artificial intelligence is having in the whole world, in our labor markets, in our economy, in schools, in the workplace, the reality is that the transparency should not only be a technical issue. It's not only how much we get into the developments and get to know the information that was lying behind and the conceptual frameworks of the algorithms. It has to do with the whole system and the whole deployment of these technologies in terms of delivering and interacting with humans and with communities. It's important across other areas of ethical governance mechanisms that are covered by the recommendation in order to identify, monitor, and assess positive and negative impacts of AI system. And this is the whole thing. How do we ensure that these accountability mechanisms that are triggered with the principles I just mentioned brings to the more reflective view of the deployers of what could go wrong and how can you avoid things from going wrong? And this is something that you cannot codify everywhere. You cannot legislate everywhere. It's for the people that are developing this to have this ethical reflection and to make sure that we create at least the incentives for them to put it together. And that's why the recommendation or member states through the recommendation requested UNESCO to develop an ethical impact assessment, at least to make the questions, the right questions, no, in terms of the data comprehensiveness, the data quality, the data representativeness, the question of how you develop the algorithms, even to ask if the teams are diverse, because this data that you have of 85% of all these technologies being deployed by or developed by male-only teams, it's introducing already a lot of biases. But if we are able to at least put that question, I think that we will be making a lot of progress, and this can lead us to the higher goal that member states agreed in the recommendation to ensure that these systems are fair, that are inclusive, are sustainable, and that produce outcomes that strengthen the rule of law. And therefore, this is where I want to leave the conversation. The technical part that many of you, the technical people, might have more idea in terms of how you trace it, how you build it, how you, and I go for the higher political message in terms of ensuring that these systems need to be understandable, need to be able to deliver for the public good, and then to develop the standards that will help us to ensure that this is the case. Finally, the member states in the recommendation ask UNESCO to support with the monitoring and evaluation of policies, because at the end, the policy space in which these things happen will deliver for good or for bad. And so transparency is also closely linked to the need to increase awareness and literacy, which is another principle of the recommendation. So I wish you well in this discussion. I was this morning in another panel with some partners of the recommendation, and we were talking about legislation, and we were talking about regulation, talking about institutions, and how governments are lagging behind the market. As usual, it's not new that regulators are lagging behind the markets everywhere. But at the end, because of the impact, the speed, the pervasiveness, and the way it is shaping a new world, it's really important that we get it right. And that's why UNESCO is very proud to host you today, and looking forward for the conclusions of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. It's very interesting and enlightening to hear about the rationales behind UNESCO's process of reflecting and reporting on what meaningful transparency means for algorithmic systems, especially considering this is an organization that's thinking policy for very different national contexts. But now we're going to hear a bit about one specific national context in Brazil from Laura Schertel Mendes. So please, Laura, whenever you're ready, feel free to start.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Clara, and good morning to everyone. I would like to thank UNESCO for this important forum to discuss the topic of transparency of AI systems, and a special thanks to Daphne's team, Joa and Kimberly, for all the organization and for helping us to putting this panel and to organizing this side event. I would like to thank as well all of our partners and co-organizers of this panel, the Center for Technology and Society at FGV, the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency, ACT, the Global Network Initiative, and the IGF Coalition on Platform Responsibility, IDP Brasilia, and Goethe-University Frankfurt am Main. In a context in which there is a growing debate on regulating AI, Brazil is also dealing with this issue, and there is an ongoing agenda on AI regulation in our parliament. I would like to give an overview of this process, highlighting the role of transparency and explanation rights in our national debate. Several studies and international recommendations, such as the important UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics presented here today, have highlighted the impacts of AI systems on individuals and society, such as their opacity, complexity, dependence on a large amount of data, and discriminatory potential. Adequate regulation is therefore an important factor to enable the development and application of safe and trustworthy AI systems in compliance with the Brazilian legal framework and constitutional freedoms. The issue is challenging in Brazil and worldwide. It is complex, horizontal, multidisciplinary, and involves unintended consequences of the use of technology in different social contexts. The Brazilian Federal Senate established a legal experts committee in February 2022 to support the regulation of artificial intelligence in our country. I was the rapporteur of this committee, which has presented a report with a draft bill at the end of the year. Clara was also a member, and Justice Ricardo Cuiva was the president of this committee. After 9 months of work, during which more than 60 experts were heard in multi-sectoral public hearings and one international seminar, the committee presented a report with a draft bill on AI regulation. The hearings brought many important inputs, such as the idea that principles alone were not sufficient to guide AI providers and operators. It has been said very strongly that there is a need of more concrete norms, more concrete and operational rules. The concept of AI should cover not only machine learning, but also approaches using logic and knowledge representations, since one has to look at the impacts of these systems. The centralized governance structure is necessary to guarantee the rights of those affected in a harmonized manner and to provide legal certainty. A society as structurally unequal as the Brazilian one needs to pay special attention to the discriminatory potential of AI systems derived from technical and social biases. After analyzing all the inputs that we received, as well as examining in depth different topics, the committee decided to adopt a comprehensive approach of the law. This is due to several reasons. For instance, consistency and continuity in the Brazilian tradition on regulating technology. We are used with comprehensive laws such as the Brazilian civil rights frameworks, Marco Civil da Internet, the Consumer Protection Code, and the Data Protection Act. Limitations of the Data Protection Act regarding artificial intelligence and algorithms. On the one hand, training data isn't always personal data, and the Data Protection Act wouldn't apply in this context. On the other hand, applying data protection rules to inferences is also challenging. Just to mention some of the challenges regarding data protection and AI. The whole life cycle of AI must be covered, not only the decision-making process, but also the creation of models and data training. And the idea that a comprehensive regulation with a central coordination seems to be the best way to achieve the goal of harmonized standards and enforcing rights regarding the impacts of AI in specific sectors. The bill has 5 main axes: principles, the guarantee of a list of rights to people affected by AI systems, the categorization of the level of risks of AI systems, governance measures and obligations and specific requirements, and the last one, the enforcement and enforcement structure. As for the first act, the bill established many principles, which are good faith and other 12 principles. I'm just going to highlight some of them here. Human participation in the artificial intelligence cycle, life cycle, and effective human supervision, non-discrimination, justice and fairness, transparency, explainability, and auditability, principles that we are discussing today, trustworthiness and robustness of artificial intelligence systems, traceability, and non-maleficence. As for the second pillar, the draft foresees rights for people affected by AI systems, which must be observed by providers and operators of the systems, and which are also enforceable by administrative and judicial authorities. Among the foreseen rights, there is the right to receive prior information regarding interactions with AI systems. This is a very important right regarding transparency, and the right to explanation. The bill provides also for the right to challenge decisions that produce legal effects or significantly impact the interests of affected party, the right to human determination and participation in AI decisions, taking into account the context and the state of art of technological development, the right to non-discrimination, and the right to privacy and personal data protection. There are two more articles that specifies these two important rights that we are discussing here today. Article 7 specify the right to receive prior information regarding interactions with AI systems, and Article 9 of the draft specify the right to explanation. I'm not going to read all of them because it's a little bit too big. All of these basic rights aim to increase citizens' trust in AI systems, in addition to implementing at the legal level the constitutional principles of transparency, due legal process, self-determination, and equity. The risk categorization, which makes up the third act of the proposal, operates with two categories that receive differentiated treatment throughout the text: the AI systems classified as excessive risk and those classified as high risk. It is up to the system provider prior to placing it on the market to perform a preliminary assessment to classify the degree of risk. High risk systems, on the other hand, include systems applied in areas such as operation of critical infrastructure, education, recruiting, screening, filtering, and candidate assessment, private and public services that are considered essential, credit assessment, administration of justice, health, and criminal investigation, among others. The fourth act of the bill is composed of government measures which constitute a set of due diligence and internal process to be adopted by the agents that provide or operate AI systems, such as the adoption of transparency and data management measures. High-risk systems require for the implementation the observation of specific governance measures in addition to those that already apply to all systems. Among these measures, I highlight the algorithmic impact assessment, documentation, the use of tools to automatically record system operation, the performance of tests to assess appropriate levels of reliability, and the adoption of technical measures to enable the explainability of the results of AI systems. The fifth pillar of the bill is about the enforcement structure. In our report, the Commission argues that an administrative structure is needed in Brazil to ensure the rights of the person concerned in a harmonized way and to provide legal certainty for the enforcement of the law. Considering the contributions received by the committee, it has become clear that centralized governance structure is necessary to guarantee the rights of those affected in a harmonized manner. The proposal calls for the government to entitle a competent body to enforce the act and to coordinate and cooperate with sectorial agencies. This body will have, for instance, to review impact assessments, update the list of high-risk purpose, monitor the compliance of high-risk systems obligations, and ensure the exercise of the rights of affected persons, among others. Just as important as these attributions is the coordination and cooperation with the sectorial regulatory authorities, which is also regulated on the bill. As can be seen, the proposal presented by the Federal Senate by this committee assumes that safe and trustworthy artificial intelligence systems can be implemented by guaranteeing rights and structuring a system of governance and forecasting obligations according to the respective risks generated. Ensuring the transparency of AI systems is a persistent focus throughout the bill, from principles to the rights of the affected persons, from general governance rules applicable to all systems to specific rules applicable to high-risk systems, from the publicity of algorithmic impact reports to special rules applicable to systems used by public authorities. As Gabriela Ramos already explained, guaranteeing transparency has many goals. I'm just going because I have, I think, just 1 minute left, and I'm just going to pass through very quickly. There are many goals as to guarantee transparency. Disclosing when AI is being used. Transparency means enabling people to understand how an AI system is developed, trained, and deployed in specific domains so that people can make more informed choices. One should know that an automated system is being used and understand how and why it contributes to outcomes that impacts people in general. Transparency also refers to facilitating public multi-stakeholder discourse to foster general awareness and understanding of AI systems and increase acceptance and trust. And very important, and that's why the panel, that's why we named the panel Multilevel and Meaningful Transparency, is that transparency is present in the whole life cycle of AI. So it's very important to guarantee transparency through the value chain of AI as well. Automated systems should provide explanations that are technically valid and meaningful to everyone and to any operators or others who need to understand the system and calibrate it to the level of risk based on the context. So that's the idea of multi-level transparency. And it has to be meaningful as well. What I see as a challenge is how to encourage through legislation the development of explainable systems models, such as techniques used to automate the process of explaining such systems that we know that are under research. If regulation could encourage this, I think that's a good question, and maybe we could debate it as well. So that was an overview of the process that Brazil is facing right now, and I'm looking forward for the questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to hand it over to Jason now.
So thank you. Thank you very much, Clara. Good morning. Bonjour. Bon dia. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to echo Laura and thank UNESCO for hosting us and all the co-panelists for being here as part of this panel. In my brief remarks, I want to try and do three things. First, I want to give a bit of a historical context to the work that's been done on transparency around digital platforms to date. I also want to identify a few high-level lessons that have been learned from those experiences. And then last, I'd like to share a few initial observations about the draft guidelines for digital platform regulation that UNESCO has developed, and specifically the provisions in those draft guidelines that touch on algorithmic transparency. So first, just to kind of give a little bit of the timeline around transparency, it's important to remember that the early scrutiny of tech platforms, digital platforms, really focused primarily initially on their responses to government demands and pressures. So in the early 2000s, there were a number of cases that came to light where platform providers of either email services or social media services were asked by governments either to censor content or to hand over user data. And the companies, whether denying or responding favorably to those requests, inevitably ran into certain controversial situations. And that led to a series of conversations among companies, as well as across civil society organizations, academics, socially responsible investors. Those conversations then ultimately merged into a process that produced the Global Network Initiative principles on freedom of expression and privacy, which together with a more detailed set of implementation guidelines, essentially provide guidance for responsible company conduct on a range of measures, including due diligence processes, appropriate board oversight, and decision-making in response to government demands. Those principles, the GNI principles, were then operationalized through an oversight mechanism, which is the Global Network Initiative, the organization that I'm the director of. So that was in 2008. And it is interesting to look back at that time and recognize that the GNI principles, when they speak specifically to transparency, take a two-step approach. The GNI principles call on member companies, and I should clarify, GNI is a multi-stakeholder organization. So we have member companies like Google participating. We also have civil society organizations, academics, and investors representing the sort of early participants in those conversations from the mid-2000s. What the principles say specifically about transparency is that member companies will be held accountable through a system of A, transparency with the public, and B, independent assessment and evaluation of their implementation of the GNI principles. So transparency with the public is a relatively self-explanatory concept, but it's notable that the first ever company transparency reports were produced soon thereafter. Google put out the first company transparency report in 2010, which set off a trend that eventually spread to most major platforms and also to telecommunications companies, and since then to a number of other service providers in the information communications ecosystem. But what is independent assessment? So that's the second part B of the GNI approach to transparency. And GNI assessment is a process that requires member companies to use independent third parties that GNI itself accredits to review their internal systems and policies, interview relevant employees, and conduct case studies, all with the eye to determining whether the companies are implementing the broader principles and guidelines in good faith with improvement over time. So that is the process results in a report by the independent assessor, which is presented to GNI's multi-stakeholder board, which then determines whether that standard has been met on the basis of the information provided, as well as interviews with the assessor and the company. So that's how GNI approaches transparency. Since those early transparency reports that I referenced, starting in 2010, both the scope and the detail and the frequency of the information provided in company transparency reports has expanded significantly. In 2012, Google added, in addition to information about how it responded to government demands, it added information about its processing of copyright requests that came through the Digital Millennium, the DMCA. And then since then, we've seen platforms also include information about how they implement company level content moderation decisions in their transparency reports. There's a couple of other interesting examples since then. Just last year, Facebook contracted with Ernst & Young to produce an independent audit on its content moderation processes, which I think was the first time that we've seen an audit of that sort made public. And then, of course, the Meta Oversight Board, which was created a couple of years ago, provides an additional layer of review and transparency around Facebook's content moderation decisions. Then more recently, bringing up sort of to the present and to the topic of this specific panel, we've seen a kind of explosion of emerging experimentation with approaches to algorithmic transparency. We've seen governments conducting algorithmic audits, so far mostly in the competition context, as well as civil society and academics and researchers conducting external audits of specific tools, such as facial recognition technology, all of which has sort of generated a lot of interest among regulators, and is the reason why we're talking about this today in the context of the proposed guidelines. So to pull out a couple of lessons from this kind of decade plus of experience with transparency reporting, I think first, it's important to note that meaningful transparency should enable understanding, which means that it requires context, right? Simply disclosing data or information without context isn't ultimately very useful. Some have called this need for contextual understanding through transparency observability. It essentially means the ability for civil society or other independent experts to scrutinize platform actions as well as the outcomes of those actions. And this can be particularly challenging when it comes to algorithmic systems. Second lesson learned is that disclosure alone is not sufficient. To quote from the Dynamic Coalition on Platform Responsibilities 2022 outcome document, transparency and accountability should not merely imply the disclosure of information, but also the auditability of the disclosed information. In other words, there should be a process for review that facilitates questions and discussions around the disclosed information. So the GNI framework that I described provides one model for a multi-stakeholder assessment of disclosed information, but there are other approaches that may make sense in other contexts. And lastly, participation of different actors with distinct expertise and perspective is really key to making transparency meaningful. This is especially necessary, I would submit, in the context of complex algorithmic processes that require both sophisticated technical understanding of algorithms and of computer science and coding, as well as nuanced understandings of the kinds of risks and impacts that particular populations or users might face. And so the GNI model, again, provides an example of how different stakeholders can come together. Another initiative that GNI has been involved in is the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency that was mentioned earlier, where we're working together with FGV and other organizations to bring together a wide range of expertise to really dig into and try and understand what meaningful transparency means. I'm going to just say a couple of things quickly about the UNESCO guidelines in closing. So I think the guidelines themselves pay a lot of attention to algorithmic systems that underlie many platform business models and decision-making. But I would submit that the approach in the guidelines on algorithmic systems specifically, as with, unfortunately, I think a lot of the guidelines, is underdeveloped, and there is a need for significantly more nuanced understanding and detail if these guidelines are to play a useful role vis-a-vis the regulatory developments around the world. Maybe I'll stop and we can get into perhaps what some of those guidelines, what those points in the guidelines are that could use additional clarification later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And I will tell you right away that we already got a couple of questions from the online audience addressing the same sort of issue that you're concerned about, and what else we could think in terms of mechanisms for promoting transparency. So I'm pretty sure we're going to have a conversation about that very soon. Also, if anyone else that is listening to us, please feel free to send your questions and we'll address them. We'll also open it for the presential audience, of course, by the end of the panel. And now we're going to hear from Alexandra, please.
Thank you. And thanks for including Google in the conversation today. Transparency has long been a core value for Google. As Jason ran through, we were the first company to produce a transparency report in 2010. And so that has really influenced our thinking about how we can do this work and how we can evolve it over time. Transparency is especially important to us because our users demand it, and we see it as an important part of being trustworthy and accountable to them. So I want to share a little bit more about how we think about this issue, in particular, some of the key considerations we think about as part of this kind of policy context, and then also to give just a few examples of what it's like to do this work as a practitioner inside of a company, because just as Jason said, I think there is more work to be done to understand why we have challenges and what we can do to overcome those to ensure that there is the kind of transparency that is meaningful to the variety of audiences that are interested in it. So first, we think about transparency in and of itself as a tool. For it to be effective, it needs to establish trust and deliver accountability, but it must be clear what information is being shared with whom and for what purpose. Next, we think really that there's no one size fits all approach. What's appropriate and achievable for one social media company might be different for a search company or product or a cloud product, cloud services provider, et cetera. So there needs to be different transparency approaches for different online services and platforms. Next, we think about the need to have a shared understanding and lexicon around transparency broadly. I know that this is what lots of us at this conference, in this room, and on this panel are focused on doing, but there's really more work that needs to be done so that we can ensure that we're encompassing the wide range of activities about how information is gathered and who it's provided to, whether that's to regulators, to external auditors as part of different processes and systems. All of those things need to be taken into consideration. And then last, when it comes to legislative proposals or other kind of regulatory frameworks or guidance, it's important to really avoid rigid standards around transparency and data access provisions. We need clarity, of course, but it's also important to preserve flexibility and proportionality around those topics. There's been a lot of innovation by companies over the years around how to do transparency, everything from originally providing information about government requests for user data and government requests to remove content, to things like YouTube 2 years ago releasing, or a year and a half ago releasing something called the violative view rate. It was a new metric for thinking about how we think about content removal and what effectiveness looks like. And that's just in the content space. There are other things we've done, things like model cards in the cloud space that help the public and developers understand what the models are most optimized for, and then also what they might not be best used for. So there's still lots of innovation happening in this space around what kinds of transparency could be useful. Next, I really want to just kind of share a little bit about one way that we think about this work, and that's about thinking about transparency to whom. And one way I like to talk about this with colleagues is thinking about kind of these 4 buckets of users and the public, and those are not necessarily the same, and then regulators and researchers. We have many ways that we think about transparency to users. Lots of that happens when you're engaging with a product, when you get something surfaced to you and you can click on the side and say, why am I seeing this ad? Or when you get a piece of content removed and you get a notice and you're able to respond to that. That's transparency to the user, to the individual who's being affected. Then there's broader types of transparency for the public. Lots of these manifest as transparency reports where we're demonstrating what kind of are the aggregate numbers around removal, for example, across different policy areas or under different national laws. And then obviously there's a different type of transparency that we might provide to regulators under a regulatory scheme, and ensuring that we have proper protections around that is an important piece of the framework. And then lastly, researchers. That's something that I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to ensure that companies are making appropriate data available to researchers, but we know that it's something important for the ecosystem to ensure that there's well-informed research for us all to have as part of this policy conversation. So lastly, I just wanted to maybe highlight YouTube as an example for kind of thinking about these challenges around how we talk about transparency and then what exactly it looks like. On YouTube, there are 500 hours of video content uploaded every minute. So it's impossible for every video to be surfaced to every user. And so that's why we have recommendation algorithms to ensure that some videos are making it, some out of this giant corpus, that the appropriate videos are making it to the users who want to see them. Our systems that do that are constantly evolving and they're learning every day from all kinds of different signals. A number of these are about what a user finds satisfying, what they click on, what the watch time is, kind of survey responses, various signals are how that recommendation algorithm works. But because it's so dynamic, the nature of our systems and the range of signals taken into account, providing more transparency just is not that simple. So listing a formula for the recommendations is not going to be the answer. And in this case, one of the ways that we do that is by, or one of the ways we kind of provide transparency to users is directly to the creators. And we give them metrics around viewership and generated traffic, et cetera. So that's just one example of sort of thinking about what transparency means to whom in that context. And one of the ways we do that related to the recommendation algorithm is to provide transparency to the creator about who's coming to their channel. So again, like it's about for us thinking about ways we can provide and maintain flexibility so that we can continue to iterate on ways that we can provide meaningful transparency without the rigidity that might, I think, lose some of the important things we should be thinking about in terms of transparency. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And now, Yasmin, please.
Thanks, Clara. Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I'd like to greet all the speakers and also to thank Professor Clara Keller for the moderation. It is a huge honor to be here today to discuss such a critical topic that is currently at the interface of the AI and platform regulation, that is transparency over, it is, tá ligado? It is on? That is currently in the interface. You cannot hear? Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. So just like this. Sorry. So my main goal here is to present how meaningful transparency is crucial to mitigate harms of private regulation of speech by platforms, and also some of the ideas that we developed by the Dynamic Coalition on Platform Responsibility last year. There is a model framework on meaningful transparency and interoperable transparency for regulators, policymakers, and interested stakeholders. So algorithm systems and decisions are increasingly prevalent in our daily lives, especially with the rapid increase of digitalization given the pandemic. In Brazil, several public services are now occurring through online applications, and the use of predictive policing is spreading in several cities, as well as facial recognition systems. However, the use of such algorithmic systems raises several concerns about fairness, accountability, and transparency. As a result, regulators are grappling with the challenge of harmonizing legal requirements across different regulatory frameworks. As Professor Laura Scherto mentioned, in Brazil, the draft bill number 21 from 2020 is the main regulatory effort on debate so far, It aims to set requirements and principles for AI use and implementation. Regarding platform regulation, we have another draft bill, number 2630 from 2020 also, which is also on debate. But in my assessment, is still not paying the necessary attention to algorithmic systems in platform governance. In spite of this lack of attention, algorithmic systems are also ubiquitous in social media platforms. They are used not only to target ads to users, but also in content moderation, curating users' feeds, personalizing and pushing recommendations, as well as deprioritizing and filtering content according to very obscure criteria. While these algorithms can enhance user experience and engagement, they also raise concerns about transparency, accountability, and potential bias, especially regarding access to information and the opinion forming. These issues are considerably worrisome because private companies are privately regulating speech in ways that we cannot understand entirely, and the medium citizen cannot even notice. To clarify some of these issues, I will quote Professor Zeynep Tufekci's work. Tufekci shows in an article about algorithmic harms in social media platforms that when the Black Lives Matter protests were starting in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of an African-American teenager, while she could have access to the content about the protests changing her Facebook feed to chronological order, the default feed, based on personalized recommendation, was pushing the Ice Bucket Challenge. To sum up, the Ice Bucket Challenge was drowning the debate about Ferguson because of algorithmic recommendation. The metrics of social media platforms to recommend content are based on engagement. In Tufekci's words with Ferguson, what had happened was a feedback loop. Because it was hard to like the Ferguson news, the algorithm showed it to fewer people, which led to fewer exposures, which led to fewer people being able to comment on it, which led to what she called an algorithmic spiral of silence. While this sort of tough content is difficult to engage with, on the other side, outrageous news, fake news, and claims, etc., are the type of content that has the potential to go viral. There are several studies showing this now. I particularly like the research conducted by the professors William Brady and Molly Crockett from the Department of Social Psychology from Yale. Drawing from Professor Tufekci's work, social media platforms do not necessarily control what we see, but they do control the game in which we play to see what we will see. They set the rules and algorithms that determine which content is shown to us and in what order. The current rules of the game prioritize engagement, which includes virality, likes, comments, and shares. The problem with this approach is that it can create feedback loops that reinforces existing biases and impede public opinion forming. Moreover, the focus on engagement gives not only users but journalists and news media outlets incentives to create clickbait and sensational content, focusing on grabbing users' attention. This leads us to a race to the bottom in terms of quality and reliability also of the information available on social media platforms. Another use of AI in platform governance is in content moderation. The large amount of the content moderation performed by social media platforms is based on AI systems, what we call industrial moderation. They are built upon databases containing flagged content, image-based or text-based. In a superficial look, it seems that the algorithmic systems are auto-functioning, but they are continuously built by content moderation workers, mostly based in global south countries where the labor legislation is flexible, working in a slave-like situation, earning less than $1 per day, and developing several mental issues because of the sort of content they have to face when building those databases. Nevertheless, companies are profiting more money than several countries' GDPs While content moderation is the main asset of the social media platforms because a well-moderated platform is necessary for keeping users engaging, the companies won't move a finger for improving workers' conditions if they are not held accountable internationally for their rights violations. Furthermore, AI-based moderation often leads to false positives because of lack of context, also impacting more heavily non-Anglophone countries, since the databases that feed the AI systems are mostly written in English. In this regard, we can have both a censorship of licit and lawful speech, or a lack of moderation of content that is illicit and unlawful. And it is especially difficult to assess and evaluate what is the real importance that platforms give to moderation in South countries. In Brazil, for example, the Superior Electoral Court made agreements with social media platforms to address and avoid disinformation in the 2022 elections. In spite of their good intentions, we couldn't have access to basic information regarding how content moderation was being performed in the country, such as how many people were responsible by content moderation in Portuguese, or how much they were investing financially in their staffs. Without such basic information, we cannot know if they are fulfilling their agreements. Furthermore, info about how much content is removed looks good in the news media outlets, but we still don't know how much and which type of content is being shadow banned, deprioritized, or prioritized by these platforms. In spite of these issues, considering that the major social media platforms, are private enterprises, it is difficult for the public sector to design and implement regulation that is capable of both respecting freedom of the market and avoiding the spread of online harms, especially without impeding innovation and violating industrial secrecies. There are also practical limitations for transparency in algorithmic systems. One is the potential for information overload, particularly in complex systems that generate a large amount of data. Another is the risk of reverse engineering, where bad actors could use transparency requirements to identify vulnerabilities in the systems and exploit them for nefarious purposes. With these challenges, regulators need to develop standards for responsible algorithmic decision-making in social media platforms, which encompasses ensuring meaningful transparency. These standards should take into account the broader societal impact of algorithms and the potential harm they can cause to individuals and groups. In the paper Towards Meaningful and Interoperable Transparency for Digital Platforms, and I'm finishing, that was developed by the DCPR last year in partnership with the CTS FGV. We propose that the regulators should recognize that transparency is not an end in itself, but rather a means to an end. Therefore, they should ensure that transparency requirements are accompanied by other measures, such as independent oversight and continuous audit mechanisms, to ensure that platforms, algorithms, and systems are fair, accountable, and ethical. Also, to overcome the limitations that I mentioned before, regulators need to establish clear guidelines on what information should be made transparency, how it should be presented, that is, the methodology and information that should be presented in platforms' reports, as well as on mechanisms to protect the privacy and security of sensitive information. To improve the current platform transparency scenario, content moderation policies and frameworks should effectively contribute to making social media platforms accountable for harmful activities while offering precise indicators regarding how to be held accountable. We understand that to achieve meaningful transparency in content moderation, regulators or social media platforms should outline measures that ensure observability and create interoperable standards on transparency. I think that's it, but in summary, content moderation policies and frameworks should contribute to making social media platforms accountable for these harmful activities while offering precise indicators. Meaningful transparency can be achieved by ensuring observability, providing context, and creating these interoperable standards. In this sense, we applaud the guidelines drafted by UNESCO, especially regarding the data access for research purposes, which should be a step forward to ensure observability. And we also hope that platforms will follow such directives in order to increase users' trust and respect human rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, and thanks to all the panelists for their very insightful inputs. And we have a bit more than 20 minutes for questions, so I'll start by inviting our present audience to pose their questions. If you're comfortable telling us your name, please do so. Yes, I see we have one there. And okay, so please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Gustavo. I'm also from Brazil. I did my law school back in Brazil, and I'm pursuing a master's of public policy here in France at Sciences Po. So my question is for the whole table, but I'm quite particularly interested in the insights from Alexandria, given that I think her experience can be quite insightful at Google. So I wrote it down. I'll just follow my little script. So there is a growing literature raising the argument that analog solutions for freedom of expression don't translate so well into cyberspace, and particularly platforms content moderation. For instance, there's a recent article by Evelyn Dweck that she argues that the classic case-by-case due process judicial approach with binary outcomes don't address so well the factual circumstances of moderation at the platform level. Some of these characteristics are that the flow of information is systematic, it's complex, it's fast-paced, and these entail distinct technical trade-offs that only exist in cyberspace that otherwise didn't exist in the analog space. For instance, one of the examples that she brings is a decision to under-remove or over-remove a certain type of content, potentially harmful, but also potentially informative content. My question is, what are the other kind of trade-offs at the technical level that we need to address in support of the implementation of normative rules, such as human rights? And following that, shouldn't algorithmic transparency also include information on how platforms solve these trade-offs?
Thank you so much, Gustavo. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just two questions. Very briefly, we've heard from Google about the video recommendations and that are being made according to algorithmic formulas. And my question would be related to the degree of disclosure. To what extent those algorithmic systems are being disclosed, and what are the different criteria that are being taken into consideration when disclosing to the various types of users. And then the second question is maybe for Transparency International. They have mentioned that UNESCO guidelines are underdeveloped. Could you, or requires further development, could you provide examples of what areas require development? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll take the next question.
Thank you. My name is Khaled Mansour. I serve on the Meta Oversight Board. And my question is to the Brazilian presenters, as well as maybe to Jason, is the dichotomy between having very good and strong national laws trying to be imposed or enforced on global enterprises. What you will end up with is not a racial order, but an order that certain countries, because they can impose sanctions on these corporations, their laws will be respected, while others will not be. So the Ugandan laws on banning homosexuality, for example, over social media, most likely will not be respected, while maybe certain Brazilian laws will be respected because maybe a certain corporation has an office there and can be sanctioned. So my question would be then, don't we actually need some sort of like global norms that member states of the UN or whatever would agree to? And where in this does this document, the guidance that Jason spoke about, falls? I mean, how useful it is? Does it lead in that way or not? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next question, please. I will take one more and then I'll take it over to the panelists, not without adding my own first. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for your very interesting insights. My question is more on user-facing transparency. So when we talk about these recommender systems, I think Jason touched on it in terms of contextual transparency. How do we make sure when we provide more transparency to users, also about how these recommender systems work, that it's actually something that helps them make more meaningful decisions about their online experience? And what kind of role do you think digital literacy and AI literacy also plays in this? Because I think that's maybe overlooked a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. 1 minute, I'm going to add 2 questions from the online audience. So the first one I already teased Jason about was also a question about mechanisms. And I see almost a little bit of heat. I think it relates a bit to what the second question mentioned about the underdevelopment, the possible underdevelopment of the UNESCO guidelines. So there's a lot of concern with like the role of that technological tools also have in improving transparency. That's a question from Nusa Boyema, and I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name right. There's also an anonymous questions about technical difficulties and the role of interdisciplinarity. So yeah, that's also very much related to the concerns you expressed by the end of your input, Jason. And I just got one specific question for Laura, which is, in your work, are there any features of AI regulation being considered in Europe that you concluded were not suitable for Brazil because of particular features of Brazil's legal or political system? So my idea now is to go over all our panelists. I will invite them to cater to the questions. Don't feel like you have to answer all of them. Feel free to self-service. And after that, I'm hopeful we'll have time for more questions. So if you could keep it between 2 and 3 minutes, that would be ideal. Thank you so much. And I'll start with Laura in our original order.
Thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with the one that was directed to me. I think since the AI Act doesn't provide for rights or for principles, we understood, and I think that's I would say the most, I think that's the big difference that we have between the both proposals, the Brazilian and the AI Act, because if we read all the justifications and the considerations, the idea is that you could enforce, you shouldn't have enforceable rights by the judiciary, and we thought we reflected a lot about it, and we think we couldn't enforce just technical measures, just requirements through the administrative body, but we think the judicial application of the law is still an important enforcement measure. So that's why we provided in this draft bill for principles and for rights. And I would say that this was maybe an important difference when we compare the two proposals.
Thank you so much, Laura. Just to add that the question was posed by Tom Barraclough, and I'm sorry, Tom, for not mentioning your name before. Jason.
Wow, so this is a lot of questions. Let me start by pointing out some of the, I think, specific provisions in the draft guidelines. So more generally, the Global Network Initiative where I work submitted comments to UNESCO in response to the draft 1.0 of the guidelines, and those are available on our website, and recommend people take a look at them. UNESCO has since come out with a draft 2.0, which is the version of the guidelines that we'll be discussing in the next couple of days. I'm happy to see that that version, I think, represents improvement on a number of dimensions, but they still leave a lot of questions unanswered, and there's still a lot of room for continued improvement. I'll focus here specifically on some of the aspects that deal particularly with algorithms. I think at a very general level, there's a broad sort of challenge when it comes to addressing the role of algorithms that I think Gustavo's questions, channeling Evelyn Dueck, kind of allude to, which is that there's a risk if we focus so much on the algorithms themselves that we stop paying attention to the underlying conduct of individuals that is ultimately harmful and is ultimately producing negative impacts on human rights. And so there's a need to really sort of understand, as Alex was illustrating, sort of the different ways in which algorithms work at different levels for different types of services. And it gets very complicated and very sort of nuanced very quickly when you start sort of breaking down the different kinds of machine learning and other algorithmic or AI-driven processes that different services provide, and the ways in which they interact with one another. And so I think there's just a need for the guidelines sort of at a very high level to better understand and articulate those differences, because otherwise what we see is there's a real risk that governments take a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to trying to deal with some of the content-related harms that are very legitimate and need to be addressed. But the one-size-fits-all approach ultimately ends up having a lot of unintended consequences, especially for freedom of expression. I think more specifically, there is, just pointing out there's a section in the guidelines on the use of automated systems for content moderation and curation. Several paragraphs there. Within that, there is language calling on platforms to commission regular external audits of machine learning tools utilized for content moderation. So this is the kind of language that sort of intuitively seems like it makes a lot of sense, but it raises a lot of questions, to me at least. For instance, why do these audits need to be external? What's the value of an external audit versus an internal audit, or an audit that's conducted with some degree of cooperation? Ultimately, the people who understand algorithms best are the people who work with those algorithms on a day-to-day basis within a company. And so again, sort of, the idea of external as sort of equivalent to independent or equivalent to sort of, providing some degree of accountability sort of makes sense. But when you get down to it in practical terms, you really do need internal involvement often in order for anybody, whether they're external independent auditors or whether they're regulators themselves, to really fully understand and comprehend the way that these algorithms are going to work, and therefore what might need to change. Separately, the focus on machine learning tools is not explained, right? Machine learning is just one category of algorithmic technology, but the guidelines only focus here on machine learning. And furthermore, there's a focus specifically on content moderation. We heard from Yasmin and others that algorithms play lots of different important roles with respect to what content is seen, with respect to how information surfaces across different platforms for different users. So again, content moderation can mean different things to different people. The guidelines themselves don't do a particularly clear job, in my opinion, of describing what they mean by that. So these are just a few examples. There's other provisions. For example, the guidelines call on users to be given the ability to control the algorithmic curation and recommender mechanisms used to suggest content to them. I'm not sure what the drafters understood by the term control, but I don't think that's actually the right word. I don't think it's maybe even possible or necessarily advisable for users to be given control of the algorithm. I think there is an understandable and probably worthwhile objective to give choice to users and allow them to have some degree of choice as to the way in which content surfaces on their feeds or on their services. But that's very different from control, at least my understanding of that term. this is just the last example I'll give. The guidelines introduce a distinction between the special limits in terms of amplification and recommendation as distinct from organic/algorithmic amplification and recommendation. Again, I don't know what organic amplification or recommendation means, but that seems like a very important concept if you're going to introduce it to clearly define and understand. So there's a lot in these guidelines, and I don't want to be too critical. I mean, I understand that this is a very broad exercise. There's a lot that these guidelines are attempting to try and put into a single coherent framework. But at the end of the day, that complexity, I think, is underappreciated and needs to be reflected upon. And that's why we have recommended that UNESCO take a step back and take more time to consult carefully and openly with a wide range of stakeholders about what it is exactly that they intend these guidelines to achieve and how best collectively we as a global multi-stakeholder community can work together to achieve those objectives. Unfortunately, the process so far has not involved a lot of that open, transparent consultation. And so that's why we're calling for more of that going forward.
Thank you so much, Jason. Alex?
Tough act to follow, Jason. I think maybe what I'll do is, I think, Gustavo, your question was really interesting. And I'll just say, for a company that has very clear commitments to human rights and commitments to UN guiding principles in particular, and the GNI implementation guidelines and principles, thinking about how we live up to those and use technology to help us do that is sort of what is the bread and butter of what we do on a daily basis. So there are oftentimes ways in which we're thinking about the trade-offs between how do we achieve those values, and then what are the technical capabilities we have to do that. So of course, Evelyn presented one about sort of, like adjudication. That's one example, but there are all sorts of examples. This is not even an AI example, but when you think about requests for content removal, like when we get a government request for content under, we obviously have a way that we evaluate both what is our understanding of the national law, and then how do we uphold our commitments to freedom of expression in the process of responding to that request. Usually what we do when we find that that request is something that's illegal under the national law, we geo-block that. So we remove the content from the country where the government made the request. In the world, the piece of content remains available. And that's a technical capability that we have. And so just to say that, like, it really, the technicalities are what underlie lots of the details about the approaches we take to responding to any kind of removal on the content side or other things as they relate to privacy or other issues. Another example that is in the AI space is, machine learning is useful to us in training our classifiers to identify potentially violative content that might violate our community guidelines, for example, on YouTube. But it's only helpful if there are high precision recall rates. So if it's not well trained yet, if we don't think it's accurate enough yet, it doesn't help us become better or faster at removing content. In fact, it just creates more noise for us. And so when we use them is a function of our technical understanding of, do we have enough accuracy that in fact it will support us in being better at doing content moderation instead of making us less effective. So there are lots of ways in the decisions we make every day that are about the kind of trade-offs and what are the opportunities to use technology to make us better at respecting rights in our daily work. I also wanted to, I didn't catch your name, but I think, digital literacy is an important part of thinking about how users and the public can understand what the information is that we're sharing with them. And I use the ads example, which I think is a good one, because it's like, when you put something into search and an ad comes up on the side, you can click, why am I seeing this ad? And it will give you some information and also let you know that you can go to myaccount.google.com and understand what are the reasons you are seeing things, and you can change the types of ads you would be getting or the types of information that's being collected. And so making sure that we have both user control mechanisms that are tied to kind of understanding why you might be seeing particular things. So just to say, yes, digital literacy is something that I think continues to be important and is obviously something UNESCO is very invested in and something we partner with UNESCO on also. And then lastly, this is not necessarily really just a specific question, but I think overall, maybe the kind of systemic approach has come up in a lot of questions. And I think that's something that we think continues to be really important because of the volume at which we kind of are making decisions about content all the time. Litigating any single one of them, not in the legal sense, but in the colloquial sense. Yes, we may make a mistake and need to put a piece of content up or have missed something and need to remove it. But ultimately, as a first order, really understanding, do companies have at base a system in place to govern how they do this work? Do they have a process for like, are they public about their policies? Do they have systems in place for creating new policies and evaluating them for appeals, like appeal mechanisms, et cetera? All these things are pieces of an important content moderation system that a company should have, and thinking about that as the way you evaluate companies rather than specific metrics or specific ways that we must be transparent. I think where we're at in the conversation, that's really kind of what we've, I think, coalesced around. What the kind of particulars of any one thing, getting too entrenched in them could really, I think, send us down a path where we're not focused on what's most important for helping users understand how they're interacting with a platform, and also for helping regulators understand how platforms are operating, and so they can hold us accountable where necessary too.
Thanks, Alex. Now I'm gonna hand it over to Yasmin, also asking you to make any final remarks you might have. And I'm gonna pass it over to to Alex, Jason, and Laura for their final remarks. And I'm really sorry we will not have time for more questions. So please, Yasmin.
Thank you, Clara. Just to address the question of the sir from the Meta Oversight Board. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. So about the difficulties of drafting international, how to hold platforms responsible internationally. It is really a difficult, a tough task because as Alexandra was talking about, it encompasses several AI and in platforms, platform governance encompasses several areas from the law, like data protection and human rights and labor rights and etc. But there is a proposal that I have several more questions than answers in this regard. But a proposal that I like a lot is from Professor Thomas Kadri. He has an article that is titled "Networks of Empathy," and he proposes a certification for algorithms to be implemented in platform governance, and it should encompass pluralism in the staffs that develop these algorithms to address like any type of ethical difficulties or biases that are within these algorithmic systems, and also functioning ethical committees in the enterprises that develop algorithms and etc. So I think that's it. Not sure over my time.
Yeah, do you have any final remarks?
No, I think I have several more questions than answers. So
okay, Alex, Jason.
No, I mean, first of all, just glad to have a chance to be on this panel. Obviously, these are very complicated issues, but I think this kind of conversation is really where we have to begin. So appreciate everyone bringing their different perspectives to this discussion, and all of you for coming both online and in person. I think on just the last point that Yasmin was addressing and Khalid Mansour's question, I think another suggestion to kind of read up on is because I think there is a real tension. There are going to be country-specific approaches, and that's necessary. There are different sort of cultural and legal reasons why each jurisdiction will take slightly different approaches to some of these challenges. But as the question raised, that then creates a lot of complexity and not necessarily optimal outcomes for users, and especially for human rights. So one that has been proposed and sort of smooth over some of those potential wrinkles between jurisdictional approaches is what's called the modularity approach. This is something that my friend Chris Riley and Susan Ness have written about, and so recommend folks take a look at their blog pieces describing how different jurisdictions could use multi-stakeholder processes, among other initiatives, to kind of provide a common sort of approaches to things like researcher access to data, or certification and audit and assessment mechanisms. So just some more suggested reading for anyone who's interested.
Thank you so much. Laura?
I would like to firstly thank UNESCO again for this panel and all the panelists, and to be here. And I would just like to highlight that although the panel focused on transparency, it is important to note that this principle is effective when applied in conjunction and alongside with other principles as fairness, accountability, and safety of AI systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks once again to UNESCO for having us here today. And thank you very, very much for everyone who joined us in presence or online. And have a very nice rest of the event. Bye.